I don't think you really. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
your-
yeah,
It's good.
I think so.
Okay.
Just like the stuff we generally read, I think that would be helpful. We already- This starts at 20, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, 5 minutes to start, folks, 5 minutes to start.
Right on cue.
Sorry, I thought that was too childish.
Back on the floor, please, and I would-
Hey Scott, Lincoln Teams. Lincoln Teams. It's the link is in Teams. Yeah, I just put it in there. I'm sorry. I was holding off.
That's not the way I see it.
So wait, is Lauren online?
I think everyone's,
Oh, I'm not in the Zoom.
oh, yeah.
And so is Lauren judging online?
Yeah, Lauren's judging online. Okay. Yeah. Second half. Yes, this is fine.
ready to go, folks, it's start time.
Let's do it. Is anybody not ready? Sorry, I was trying to avoid down. Is that? Is it on this one?
Yeah.
It's a string.
Do I need to? One of these computers is.
I can mute mine real quick. Oh, my computer is muted. I don't think it's a stream. I mean, should I just get started or is that?
That would be a bit too much.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Well, I can hear it, but I don't know how it's. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Yeah, that works for me, honestly.
Get started.
Yeah, we're good.
And if it's like obnoxious, I'll pause.
Competitiveness is built on taking for granted nationalism, the search for anti-competitive practices creates a reinforcing cycle of otherization. Before prohibiting any competitive life, it was asked who we must compete against and who the we is that competes against. Sort of competitiveness, international, international, anti-international, international, so reinforcing competitiveness and security and self-reinforcing national, reinforcing competitiveness. I think competitiveness reads the agenda, the nation state, lawyers, labor, fear, for has included nationalism, the outside the sexually exclusionary, divided into national, borders, national, physical, economics, for the social environment. Competitive unity, competitive, this tension between the previous and competitive, but now since the emotion is the individual, something on your parties, and we should be kind of like this, and this is right, we're having this and more munis, such as nationalism. Not as much as one American social dimension, we not as much as the activities, such as equality, cultural conditions, and evidence. Seriously, we'll make it for that question that are simultaneously global. Competition divides us through total war, the ritual cycle of Darwin's competitional ways, morality canon, international planning becomes value to us. There was no believe the ostracized through abundance and ostracized already were not the accurate integration cannot be the mother of abundance, as like the international ideals and code, as significant competition with the gospel ideologies, all the way that I won't go with the internet. Trouble is not being committed, otherwise there is no growth and wealth for the team. This is part of the environment that will talk about competition versus civilized economy without being used moral arguments such as for competitiveness is kind of like quality has launched solidarity has been dropped in much for competitive we are going to crisis enterprise new terms of the current order cannot address that preliminary concept of the public is rewritten ruler and collective legacy that generation to determine the solution to stop the practice of all the crisis so many just interaction with the we like that I'm the martial press like the beginning of serious places and for new later cycle of feelings of the less population ability and qualities and trauma call war when you imply accessibility of the terms same on the condition of the market stage of the political stage states and the way to have quality to question code is a perfect example of the knowledge of the law and the label not training is fully legal however that's not mentioned that you like against the way to cover chance to be addressed with coordination versus the migration to have nation and speaking like national so that is all referring to their actually global nature actually usually of such countries with the word of the digital climate market disability in case for some the term the public becomes like globalization generally way widening but the effectiveness of the political membership part of the free not so much the only principle of the public is aggressive international legal identities global challenges and anything not going to continue to work with one of the utopian already are millions and who use the wrongful community coverage the again their arguments and layers of possible accessibility this includes unprofessional who have change me too that be limited that because the limitation of the West Million health enterprises will be the global economic development that making the conscious of the pandemic at beyond the current crisis called globalization is also logical that nation state makes survival impossible by engaging in double exclusion that is excluding the excluded from consideration by 14. Climate change, financial situation, international production, and wars there are every nation's concerns surrounding it is an army's war for brothers, allies, but has no response to global crises and climate change starting able to address challenges, global poverty, food crisis, these institutional possibilities, basis, the possibilization, distinction, classifications, and disappear, it is not knowledge, conflict, witnessing, and a position, conventional, universal, happening in the ecological and civilization, adverse self-reduction. This is where transformation, possible modernity is about a thing between threats of border and modernization and institutions, national state national institutions are unable to conform to the cooperation. To manage to be methodological national state analysis of the borders and legitimization of global policies on national cases free government is often a way to solution excludes the excluding and concept of the global risk is the accumulation of logical and cultural and valuable information that is overwhelming persistent in there. Our reaction to and transformation double exclusion free terms seek parameters of as we can conceptualize steps to filter out the ones that are ontological cosmological commitments that dedicate and minimize life expression control and all I hate. However, relation based on questions says, as a living the field, they have that kind of what all of those of that kind of relation with the people about adding at the issue. It's all of the logical commitments, the ability to recognize others, as a human benefit of the world, and worth recognition the aspiration becomes a natural asset. Relational force that being having to have the social organization integration becomes a misconception. Have not been equal with the civil rights, others have been removed and sampled by us through civilization with the land, water, air, plants, and animals coming very close to natural responsibility to be said to the world of countries on all the world of stress and class that not being able to engage. We see a picture in moral politics and accountability. Gap reinforces certain ways as more legitimate and reinforces multiple considered for those responsible outside the only just responses to those responsibility. The who of justice determines the what we consider crisis and how we respond to that. Justice for example determines who has the right to have rights for sure. And 5. Globalization is changing, injustice is changing, justice is increasing, the West Wing framework, the citizens that was investing from international framework, seeking for international within the security is supposed to just the argument focus on the what of justice, what of without saying the who, social processes, overflow of borders, international cooperation, regulators, and investors, supranational organizations, through mass media, cyber tech, global warming, terrorism, and modern social assessment, borders of West Wing abuses, uniting with outsourcing and the racial amount of money used brought into struggles, international corporations, regulatory powers, and coalitions, and house laws, and excluding the West Wing but the argument has the alternate question of what now could turn it now into who arguments, as you all the questions, all the framers in the speeches, and as you more people who want to do economic frame must now become who's Westphalian, the fixed cities, most possible to customers of that just threat to have rights to serious local death, Westphalian frames of people of just so shielded from the here only from the more complex and current decision making in the US. German space, the key question can we integrate a post Westphalian frame, our conversation of the who, both politics open gospel politics, and we endorse transnational cross Africa, citing nationalists, open public spheres, that reimagine justice, admirable futures, bottom up, add-on movements can address the low crises and resisting demonic rifles of competition, criticism, team. The culture began to reinforce ideas of competition, so the pace of resistance and the targeting of revolution and flooding and isolation, resistance networks, the officials land outcomes and activist convergence, waves of world social forums, the individuals of foreign proxy movements of the ultimate Nigerian force goal, events, and the dozens of laboratories that have gathered to participate in the classes of the organization, and the country, political, financial, and academic activists, just to imagine desirable futures of global public sphere, utopia, space of intentionality, or conduct of moral lifestyle, transversely, the opposite side of methodology provides the creation and numbers where the ways of using possible motivations, and a methodology against patient, guarantee, against nomination, plus, and the global resources, mandatory aspirations, and against totalitarian services, and against the human life are always open. Who else make those on for realistic racism? Because the alternatives for creating space can be realistically achieved. Combating just requires working the democracy, creating new arenas and doesn't who and how bodies future. And find the movements are cleaning a say, relating the way to be a setting of the party, holy say, or I think the democracy process to be the right side of the who they are, and how by which I think the position movements are determining new arenas for organized therapy, arenas in the world social forum fashion, a politics in which they can dispute their preference, also the possible democratic justice, going to a situation from the political level and deliberation that was for the nation or ice when at least not blessed for setting and voice of the creation of arenas and the mission of members of the house of the person that receive and engage in this about the who open house policies is a process out of blueprint they struggle even if imperfect is resistance Caruso as a team. Open health plus members of water trouble the reason of open health on the blueprint is a process Caruso as mentioned about creating a freedom opening and as much as openness is the connection of penetrating tools that I was single year thinking to look laboratory for world citizenship and mutuality mutuality positive relationship between health and imagination, crisis resistance, and solidarity, future recognition, radical democracy, or methodology, and effectiveness. We need new research that is political and social theory must be redefined. That gets Schneider attack rate. Both have a definition, the definition to a cosmopolitan analysis, socializes institutions, information to take on policy as they reach and redefine the political and social. Three social studies have significant social. This study is encouraged international argument. Research research study unit of analysis. We need methodological national system humanities, humanity, nations, competition, represents a fundamental pathway to holiness. It can no longer orient the social scientific observer. It is social can only respond in the overcome methodological national students who want to give it because having the social sciences of the reason for examination, the process or research verification is involved in the language of research research based on component science and social sciences. Research and programs for demanding research basis when new reality component science has to be taken into social methodology. I would include these ideas, cosmopolitan dialogue, open, transformative spaces for social struggles. 1914. Health policy and same puzzle by learning cost of like speech dialogue opens up a sacred order and physical struggles multiple and false correction knowledge policy for information policy and the consciousness of the acquisition and all self organization and their information through the account of the role and growth in society have contributed to reaching the other formative dimensions because it is going to practice health policy process of must be the process by which it emerges our political evaluating responsible and desirable to 1914 global justice possibility global justice and political practices and the political mastery to create new possible worlds of action that we are achieved by our system because it is every creating ideas of justice can be played in political community we are judging and thinking global justice and philosophy mentioned office principles and interesting can be measured language. To speak, we should create institutional low side for internationalism, arguing, and for it is able to find institutional hyperdollars can be addressed what kind of institutional institutions over offer channels what needs to be realized as political international possible and democracy to representative channels open to all and not to overcome the operations of the life institutions of the world United National Countries has succeeded to take the UK procedures to transform the ICC, the institution of age structure or human rights one sees imaginary is desirable epistemic limits to prevent necessary transitions watching in order to meet for push to imagination. We can give ideas to policy of the Marshall Alpha, the Legion of International Revolution by market touch how to sometimes over church liberation of mind and my favorite family that will happen in the impossible church of my body. The standard that fanatic Italian this attack on little and medical is sometimes receiving possible there. There's a peaceful lighting of the floor and making it to be an artist. Resonated with the death part of my non-violence resistance possible has an artificially circumstantial closure of battle. Here's a key to friendship theory and more religion has shortening of the by continuing knowledge we need to watch to be possible as we usually because of the knowledge battery, limiting inquiry, by this which having safety and more because of the psychology university, hosting understanding consolidated so this has to be capable of the necessary universal desirable mobilize as human species and must but the whole or the part will perish only solidarity to its key to problem solving fun, and 21 global solidarity, structural features will limit to entrenched to love, and people like ecological world, and features like incrementalism and unconscious response, further respect for boundaries and equality, the possible that one will become human functionally, ethically, ecologically, and spiritually, social, problem solving, whether by asking climate change or nuclear weapons only, so we resolution to global conflict, possible climate change, global well-being depends on solidarity.
Give me like 20 seconds. to
Yeah,
just
yeah. Oh,
Do the mask change. I'm gonna grab some more.
you don't like the duckbill mask all the time?
It's good for speaking, but like useless for a little bit.
Yeah, no, we want it hard.
Okay, let me just see the Zoom setup. This is,
Oh, yeah.
I assume Lauren's hopefully here.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm gonna unmute myself for Cossacks as well.
Do you want us to both throw volumes like a mute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or, yeah, as long as your like output volume is turned off, then
Yeah.
I can speak.
I'll just keep it on until we get confirmation that Lauren is here.
Yeah. Does anyone know if she was in there for the whole AC? She said, yeah. Sure.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi has been in and out, but I'm here. I'm gonna keep my camera off, and I will join from my phone so that I can put in the chat if it gets down again, but I'm good. for
Okay.
now. Thank you.
Perfect. I'll turn my volume off. Good for.
Okay, cool. So starting now. So first, why does advocacy in debate of antitrust make debaters nationalist?
Well, we have said that the concept of antitrust is something that is driven through competitiveness, and we think that competitiveness is intertwined with nationalism.
Okay, and so reading a 1AC about antitrust that discusses competition, that makes debaters like believe in nationalism?
Sure, like we'll make arguments for why sort of the content of what is debated over or posited is important for sort of the praxis that we
Okay,
take. with
if a
this.
debater on the app defends antitrust and competition, and then on the neg, like reads a competition critique, a capitalism critique, do you take a stance on if you think that debater would end up being pro-nationalist, pro-cosmopolitan?
It is just like, it is, I guess, like, and like, I think it is less so of like whether the debater takes with them like something outside of debate, and more of just like, it is good to talk about this. It is fact. Like, we're not making an argument for why like these debaters are going to become the next like heads of the WSF or something like that. It's just like, this is something good to talk about. We think that we should center debates around.
Sure, perfect. That gets to my next question. So role of debate, so you say it's not necessarily about spilling outside of debate. Is it just like that with, I guess, what do you all see as the role of debate? What
Sure,
is the
like,
role of the negative when the app critiques
we think that
nationalism?
debate should be a place for open Cosmo. We've made arguments for why sort of meta misrepresentation structures all spaces, including debate, and why there's not sort of an opening or a vehicle for Cosmo. We think debate can be a place to hash out strategies that are working towards the telos of open cosmopolitanism. Obviously, there's different mechanisms to get there. The one I see is one such mechanism.
Okay, what does it mean to make debate open cosmopolitanism? Does
Just
that
like what I
mean
described about, like,
content, read cosmopolitan
It's just like what I described in the sense that the one EC makes it public. Both sides have propositions that have an end goal of open cosmopolitanism. The debate becomes a question of which proposals.
What if the neg responds with nationalism good? Does that achieve open cosmopolitanism or not?
Well, it is like if the neg says that the status quo is good, nationalism is good, then like obviously there's a back and forth that happens.
Okay.
And then, like we're not saying that the judges just like auto vote for open cosmo. We think that's a good vision for debate, but we think that there's still sort of a debate.
Okay, yeah, I want to talk about the movements, the transnational movements. I guess, are these like electoral?
So like the important thing is just like these movements all have a vision for achieving open cosmopolitanism, and that's one in which we sort of expand the scope of our considerations. We have defined nationalism as instances in which states or entities are beholden to a particular group of people or stakeholders. We think that scope should be expanded to consider the whole population of the globe.
Okay, cool.
I was gonna insist on borrowing.
Could we borrow your all?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
What's these piece? I was muted for that. The one in C has been set, yours just locked in case.
Can somebody just like let me know if the stream does anything weird? Sometimes my computer.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
I'm good.
Okay. Anyone not good? First off, the topicality, interpretation, topical affirming about instrumental defense expansion of the scope of the United States foreign trust laws substantially increased prohibitions that competitive business practices resolving the policy of Louisiana House of resolution and legislative for policies, federal government's legislative, executive, and judicial use of the United States government is established by the U.S. Constitution among the three branches legislature, executive, and judiciary should require action to in case should the will have something take place. The United States antitrust laws use to support that it possesses permanent intent to report the party receiving its according to statutes of short explained that the FTC has given 20 antitrust laws by federal states and is interpreted by the courts for federal statutes of short and the FTC claimed that the FTC to enforce movements of differences FTC as well to enforce section 5 of the FTC and FTC brings both other methods of competition each of the same as the court's life with the short back left usually sold to pursue criminal violations of antitrust laws. They violate each of the above words requirements of government action to enact versus fairness to requires effective competition between the F and the negative. The living for any benefit can be produced from the basis of the judge can make a decision between two sides of a relatively equal chance to prepare for a common point of basic and clash of is unique because of the iteration of limited arguments over the course of the season that forces debaters to improve their arguments, reconsider their positions, their companies unilaterally declare different sides which prevents iteration through shallow debates on particular advocacy, lack of testing, which turns case caution ways for political disagreement allows for in-depth corroboration that results in iterative improvement over arguments in severe education application for predictable seasons point flips incentives and prevents contradiction towards the case rigorous testing is key to avoid false positive polarization prove anything they said it's true caution succeed. Only purpose is exposed to contrary arguments committees its merits and agreement without which we conduct group polarization can be counteracted and increases even if the outcome turns opposing positions for problems for the concerns of those received by looking at the negative of the basis to our method agree our position was all the way over by community because our adversaries motivated to find and law purposes persuade their special and not their discovery of single right answer muscles and up to alternatives ways to correlate the arguments objectives above cannot be achieved by a non-argumentative procedure taking care of what would help us screw these positions would undercut the incentive structure based on winning and losing comes to keep the participants engaged with disagree about the same issue or not just having cross purposes that like to engage in the same context with the goal of the same rule share the same concept of winning and losing and access the same comments but follow very different styles of disagreement collapses but we like sufficient overlapping material stoppable version of the United States federal government should substantially increase prohibitions on anti-competitive private cartel practices in case where workplaces is going to secure adequate relief for an alternative for incentive low U.S.-centric antitrust creates an exclusive club that bars the global south for repeating the benefits of international law and creates a form of legal imperialism that restricts necessary protection between U.S. antitrust which privileges departments of Western transnational cartels of the genuine interests of developing countries, Michaels, and 11. Many countries like the United States world crack down on cartels entities can be found in the various suggested check board regulation Washington American law supply industry great great concern Japan United American plaintiffs are not Canadian British Japanese taking from Ukraine pay and whatever Panama or ever just against the interests of those countries and more they are not using the U.S. crack down on cartels barriers protecting corporations against overcharged customers probably the plaintiffs come for developing countries support will go forward in the court was the idea of the international law looking to European and North American countries express on the government's unregulated barriers harmony creates an exclusive law that the Supreme Court endorses the imperialism of restricting access to U.S. law and exclusive focus on sovereign interests of Western countries demonstrated by their absence of Western countries and Western supports that has long and well known history and international law barriers seems to imply all countries share the same interests in self-determination even if countries like the means of down the cartels are refusal to apply laws territorially leave certain world countries that protect against power transnational commercial actors. The courts are chosen to upgrade as museum imperialists projecting access to the court's necessary protection against Western corporate actors. The plan would resolve that United States. A better approach was to find a nice review of countries' antitrust regimes, apply that determination categorically, remove discussion with respect to comply the DOJ should review antitrust regimes for jurisdiction cases which the plaintiff or defendant is a national country that provides identical government remedy. The she's not should exercise for government support such plaintiffs and opportunities for relief is necessary to deter international cartels the case. Cosmopolitanism is the cleansing that appeals to homogeneous illegal paper over definite ethnicities and silencing identity politics called unity. Eventually, grow with nations which have ethnicities simply have superties in which each individual has flows like a metric equality fund, which all of the cities vanish into a new kind of individualistic class reason why many reproduce ethnic or national distinctions that obscure the same true of inequality that make ethnically unmarked national identities accessible mainly to elites make it an easy sense to be accepted to the contingent on the right to passports, credit cards, and culture. Credentials as sort of field of gender regimes, social identities and becoming increasingly comical and ills produce plenty of examples of independence and everything history. This cosmopolitanism is most often invoked by those who see identity politics as a mistake. National identity is important for virtual subjects and for group solidarity and collectively resist asymmetrical globalization called unity. Nations have the same relationship to abandon national local governments, projects, localities, minorities, and the nation states, building nation states, develop efforts to rationalize and total diversity, especially the way it's represented establishing symmetrical units of local government, just as it would be useful to imagine that we are working on one central area of the law, and people indicators of that national research, because of asymmetrical globalization, it would be easy to forget historical lens to collective autonomy and self-determination for many of those countries that real nations and traditions are important resources in front of the exercise of global power, multinational corporations, resistance start from local and national cosmopolitanism, utopia imagery that is equally as exclusionary as nationalist religious cultural differences are entrenched. And 13, Muslim cosmopolitanism is incompatible with cosmopolitan American and European cosmopolitanism identified with Muslims religious pilgrimages to Mecca is averse to the Western liberal version is in face of trouble mobilities and escape from solidarity and attachments for European cosmopolitanism. The mobility of Muslims is bad reminiscent of the wandering indivisible Jew and other threatening cosmopolitans such as communist national ideology made them citizens of a world for which the power leader excluding communists was not regarded as liberal, but as a threat to the church from McCarthyism. European cosmopolitanism or racializes the other rather than pardoning rather than softening boundaries to the detriment of religious groups. Europeans do well those felt penetrate this very excluded for protections rights of everyone belong. Humanity seems to be cosmopolitans that failed in the region's most visible religious minority facing exposed limitations to cosmopolitanism. If they do, and scale up the empower capitals which appears to have chance 6. It's not enough to fold cosmopolitanism into the institutionalized color of diversity. Cosmopolitanism is only efficacious within the limit frame. Cosmopolitanism degenerates for the bipolitical improvement to be capital becomes an ideology to justify exploitation of its own citizens. Cosmopolitanism is merely symbolic marker. Climate competitive hierarchy. Methodological nationalism is valid heuristic for international relations. And 15, general effect. Criticize higher education systems as social processes within the nation state from the overall point of view and neutralizes the methodologies. I object there are so good reasons to use the nation state as a unit of analysis within the material for empirical research to be found at the level of nation states. Nation is a unit of clearly defined boundaries and a clear self-definition. The nation state is one of the most important actors in the full sense of the reality of education shaped by the configuration of national education systems. The last argument by support sociological theory, Meyer and colleagues argue that those who adore the participation of nation state structures and nation states are inevitable and good and essential for global peace and economic prosperity. Failure to diversify institutions, classes, systems, and governments, and causes mass suffering. Limit 11. Psychological and political economies as scholars realized by nation states after World War II and industrial system outline variability against alpha multinational empires who have competed without J. Nation states psychological economies of scale favor nation states with a strong sense of solidarity among their citizens and makes more willing to fight wars, hate, ethnic history, tolerate redistribution, country, the province of cosmopolitanism. The world's likely to remain divided along summer powers for ages. They are unlimited sacrifice sovereignty converging into a single government and vote for self would break apart very quickly. They is opposed by the appeal to the years of European nations, all it is necessary to transcend sovereignty and competing large nation states see no benefits or rendering their summer powers cosmopolitanism is simply equate religious faith confusing on its results in disaster wrong-headed policies in a world in which nation states retain sovereignty, trade investment policies to the presuppose immortalist world by whose sense cosmopolitan areas have been distorted international efforts to address global challenges, climate policies, founder of the basic realities of the national economy, divided national development and poverty, and fail to align themselves with the interests of donor economies. The cosmopolitan era has real consequences to address serious global problems. The nation state is good and sustainable. The historical record suggests it's gaining, not losing traction. Limit 11. Transfer for examples of the sword shift towards cosmopolitanism consistent with the persistence of the nation state instead of the global market. The city of weaponized global economy organized around Europe, North America, East Asia, the emerging economies highly regionalized. It remains connected to the nation state design to the barriers of the free flow of capital goods and labor. Will this appear most multinationals or high global even globalization prove more superficial than ever has major global banks served the national governments for balancing economic nationalism. Never had post 1945 decriminalizations use subsidies on terror barriers and currency state directed credits to protect the domestic markets, the assertion of effective state control over immigration to survive ethnic against foreign immigrants. The maps of the world show independent countries that exist today far from being more about nation nationalism. Defined not xenophobia, but as a preference for the nation state remains most powerful blood force in global politics, reorganizing into a world nation states parallel to conversion from the agrarian world to an industrial world. Communities proven most effective in attracting low-skilled individuals in which large-scale societies as a nation. Joining antitrust is good and valuable for bridging scholarship and debate movements from on. In 20, all speakers and for the first time meditating interest-based questions about how to remake the financial sector debate and analyze meeting policy plans within the context of tech finance or other areas. We see how the similar to debate proposals are continuing for being too incremental. The aims can be individual and or explain socialist proposals or after the problems they seek to address and operates upstream debates rather than managing for several specific check hours and capacities of those actors. So we found different subjects about problems that start having productive policy should be very good antitrust. There's a debate had that debate can be experimenting hard to apply apples to apples comparison of what policy will do this one self-democratic framework and usually who claims why movements these movements are advancing visions of public policy change. These claims are often seen as that the scope of debates building framework of what we mean by reforming of urgent ideas of reform ideas by movements, policymakers, and academics are on the cusp of policy solutions. And nationalism is redeemable and good before let's 20. Nationalism and Republic is based on the endless reevaluation of the nation state, which cannot be overcome with the cosmopolitan narrative to ensure that nationalism is violent and it's by no means unidirectional. Nationalism could open up to all three extents specific egalitarian politics have been correlated with national projects, and it should be used as a recognition of familiarity and exclude obstruction of violence borders to reunify common things and cosmopolitan worlds can as a basis for meaningful unity is necessary to address the world. The bedrock assumption of nationalism is exclusionary is bad, false, Hoover 19. The idea of the nation like the foundation for most of the positive developments because nationalist ideology holds people representing united quality every force of life and the that all should be equal nationalism health established. But it takes mutual obligations popularized by the idea of members of the nation should support one of those types of hardship on the nationalism is representing grounds and is unable disturbing even the countries that remain peaceful after transition inclusive early coalitions of extended to a rising countries long history centralized the state is such a state of liberal provide citizens with public goods multi-ethnic alliances to be more likely to virtually to multi-ethnic really leads more encompassing national identities with governments and institutions establish policies that increase government's capacity to provide goods encourage flourishing civil society organizations promote linguistic integration west governments should develop projects for people that benefit all people of all colors.
So the winner card was market colors.
The winner card.
Winner.
Go ahead.
Is your volume, cool your volumes down, everyone is for the process. Good to know. Want to start on that case first, the Calhoun evidence. Just like given the arguments that sort of we made about the importance of representation, I'm sort of confused how cosmopolitanism papers over ethnic groups or homogenizes them.
So Calhoun says that there are different types of cosmopolitanism and different conceptions of what it means to have one's own identity.
Sure.
So,
totally.
yeah, okay. So, the argument is simply that the idea that every identity can be subsumed into some supranational higher power or authority is bad because it papers over the cultural and religious differences
Right, so
that
like
define people.
if every ethnicity or religious identity should not, like what is the alternative? Like if they should not be represented globally, then what is the alternative? Like what other alternative should we do in terms of considering
the nation state? Our evidence says that ethnic marginalized groups have an innate preference for the nation state because it is something that is comfortable to them, and it is also the source of a bunch of.
So how does like
public
the
goods.
nation state? So how does like the U.S. making a policy about some international relation things? Like how are indigenous groups or native groups in like India represented?
What do you mean?
So like you have said that the nation state is a useful locus for organizing and representing ethnic groups. So my question is like USFG as a nation state does a policy. How are indigenous and ethnic groups that are not confined to the stakeholders of the US represented in any way?
Well, I fail to see how subsuming the United States under some global authority would solve this any better, right? Like you can can make the same comparison to like the Israel-Palestine situation or Muslim integration.
That's fine. This goes to some of my other questions, which is like the one EC has theorized that we should expand the scope of a state's considerations to include all people in their considerations. Like when the USFG does something, they include the entire globe in their considerations. The two Lynn piece of evidences you read seem to conflate the state with the nation. Like, what about the affirmative do you think that this Lynn piece of evidence is responsive to?
What is a conflation between the state and the nation, and why is that bad?
Well, that's what I just explained. It's like we think that the one EC has, states like the USFG, whatever, like legislative, judicial, whatnot, expand the scope of their decision making to involve all global populations, not just the citizens of the US that they're beholden to. This Lynn piece of evidence seems to be responsive to an act that's like abolish every state ever, given that the act is nations bad or nation states bad. Like, how is this responsive?
Well, our evidence would contend that the idea of the nation state and a nation are both inextricable.
Okay, I have one last. Why does debate require effective competition between the app and the name?
Because that's the foundation of debate. If there is no effective competition, then why are we here?
It's the foundation.
Debate is about
Texas.
What's that? No, for sure. So I'll send it in the chat. I sent it.
I understand. Thank you. Okay, the doc is sent, the order is the case, then T. Does this sound good?
Yes.
Okay, judges. Still, Lauren's good, okay, I'll get started.
Extinction is from global crises, climate change, pandemics, and social collapse, migrant failures, migration crisis, solution to start from the international civil war, fall the absolute of cosmopolitanism is necessary to reverse man-based representation that brands that focus on the what of politics, so they consider the power question of who is represented. Arenas like the world social reform, product public sphere, the forces, post-Westphalian democratic justice is possible to Fraser and Cruz evidence all inclusion to Arab creates an ethical priority to reframe decision calculus towards those who do not have a voice, only incorporating global considerations to make impact comparison just any consequential support cannot be divorced from the lens of the nation state. One and C, one and two are the borders turn. They consider that man-based representation is the status quo. Rising nationalism crowds out alternative considerations of ethnicities because attachment to the nation state scapegoats those populations open cause does not homogenize ethnicities, but rather gives a representative voice for those that are currently not represented. That's Fraser and Caruso. No longer does not remove states, it just does away with the national identity behind them as a driving force for other actions and objectives. US 50 still exists after the act, but expands the scope of its consideration, where just key to solve global problems. Their evidence about the importance of nations for solidarity assumes the current paradigm where powerful nations ignore the considerations of the people on the periphery. The whole point of the app is to flip that frame on its head. 1 and 3 is utopia. Utopia is wrong, but afterwards our political imaginary. One is description, is prescription. How we think about the world is how praxis materializes. Movements on the rise now, the national system, BLM schools where I can occupy. How the end point of the WSF and further our vision is feasible at Atlantic and walk out as soon. This is no different from voting for a policy update towards the fiat implementation of plans equally utopia because there's no plan where this road ever implemented by Congress. Cross by our aims about how the act is not limited diversity. Our method is generative and desirable, but after the ask process is more important than any potential product of the app. This ensures we can hash the details and ensure that all voices are represented. Generative and social energy to movements that are good. The app is more effective than the scope ties to the nation state cause waves and retreats of policies, whether they're enacted or repealed, put into place mentally constantly because of the failures to consider everyone in our analysis. 1 C force the capture of the 0.4 Cosmo denigrates into capitalism where justifies exploitation, solvency improves, otherwise capitalism fails now, and externalities are not priced into considerations which is necessary to solve collective action problems. This is evidence the average dramatically prior to solving cap Fraser. And by Westphalian distribution did not question the adjudicative of justice. The Westphalian frames margin in the space of the box, court intelligent forces, domestic space, and ensure that's offshore parts, transnational private parts, rest of the sources of the global economy, so the associated services, frame of self-insulating sources, the distribution of diversity, also doing this framing, no claim, no way, reason, representation always are inherent in redistribution, required by government, no redistribution without representation. 1 C5 is realism, the nation states collapse. Realism is the presumption that only nation states matters, cannot solve global crisis, terrorism, warming the broader trend of transactional activity proved. That's Fraser and Beckett. Realism is the anti-hegemonic laws want to democratize decision making. That's shared many institutions are possible. Any structural screening of realism cannot explain democracy. Archie Boogie, in for realism minus the world's mechanisms are force and interest side is successful to consider this social force, but also immediately for realism way we don't think the interest of all our most democratic management. There is a few centers of power that the other side domains of the wider interest groups increase their role in decision making. The equal and agenda was systematic and hegemonic because their interests having to do with those realist critiques or confused scholars never arguing in favor of the global climate situation for us and power plans upon democracy. It's not global government. No question this in those voluntary alliances between meta-governmental institutions where coercive power is shared, right? A critique of possible democracy, state democracy, the approach to regional democracy, cannot exist, must does exist too. The thinkers of movement to Buffer's cause 1 and 6 and 7 of the nation state are inevitable and good. The app reorient sovereignty towards global welfare, tying sovereignty to the nation causes double exclusion and friends global problems. Something that's a free trade. Our political imaginary is possible and desirable. That was done above the Gillette evidence. Social communities are possible. Institutions are as codified by the nation state are not inevitable. Gillette forcing clearances into cosmopolitanism. They move kind of cosmopolitan trends which resort to absolutely isolated foundations for which the cosmopolitanism global injustice. I mean that global justice is absent. The only evidence arises social connections. The structural impact of global justice had on political imagination. The app provides alternatives to national sovereignty or cosmopolitan demands expand the horizon of democratic input and reason for responsibility. That's the Beckett and Fraser evidence is empirically works to be cited. That's the Fraser and Caruso evidence. There's no defense that there are arguments in these cards. Even cards that cause extinction because they cannot formulate solutions to global problems because they're only worried about their citizens. That embeds a logical combination that drives conflict, nationalism, causes war and genocide, that's A122, national interests can lead to world wars, national parties play upon the crisis of red national sentiments to and scapegoat picking events will lead to violence, national identity requires and other solutions will lead to violence, nationalism, unity, and plus without the wars of the defense of war, genocide, history, threats to me, genocide, massacres, civil war, and massacres. Institutions are unstable, backlash and technology destroys by initiative of order, and stride after our method means 21 the free world. Field analysts think about them to the other way. The forces target the order deeply rooted in the nature of the world. The analysts build nationalists for unlimited return. China, Russia, and solar power seems about ideals and threat graduation of Moscow contest nations material to the SES. It makes it more difficult for institutions operating views in the US. Tech innovation creates obstacles to disrupt the energies, politics, polarized makes it populists like establishing candidates more likely to attack progress, exacerbate problems, control, research, storage, detect populism, movements, real the internet, undermining communities, also jobs that nation poverty, help resist tender party solutions, movements away from the orders like continue with us, things are on divergent paths. Another Iraq will be struck as successful. There's little enthusiasm for democracy, building antitrust goods. The next argument, the absolute distributional and representation challenges to concentration on accountable banks, healthcare, etc. Because they're only solely responsible to stakeholders to act. The amendment misrepresentation, which makes only the apples on political organizing against private power. Only the absolute will capital that was done above competitions for fair antitrust turns their antitrust arguments. Paul in 20 competitions under my coordination. The periodic foreign antitrust commitments to the possible economic theory transactions or the coordination will result in optimal allocation problems. So stop short of questioning competition judgments or not. Usually the opposition the antitrust targeting small players cooperation because something understand it is not the assume this is inconsistency. It's only makes sense when assumes antitrust versus competition that it doesn't make focus on commitment order to unitary no order framework applies horizontal interfront coordinations and inherently destroying effects. Antitrust has too many legal hurdles to be effective, bringing cases, taking lawyers, and proving harm or logistical nightmares. The case will be appealed equally sure now because courts are backlog. Last arguments are more nation state good. Redeemability is not impacted for once and with evidence does not explain what nation states are good for. Stop pouting. Oh, sorry, back to place real quick. The fact that they have said that debates over antitrust can create cracks outside of debate groups of debate does take shape subjectivity. That's often some framework because it means that kind of debates matter. Go to T now. Forced affirmation of the resolution is not neutral, but a constant attempt to reinforce taking for granted nationalism through constant competition that searches for the anti-competitiveness and punishment. That's a kind of evidence. The requirements that dialogue or debate start from the competition and fixes the gaze of a research agenda and necessitates authorization and comparative reflexivity. And 21 the competition sector first one, all from the competition fixes the gaze over there. Close windows or situations there. Welfare does not imply distinction between us and other competitors. Competitiveness implies comparative reflexivity. We consider national framework to make us competitive. From a transnational perspective, the distribution between internal and external is reproduced. National society is modified as a competitive community. Forced intelligibility is ontological violence. Expression is defined by incommensurate filters. And the one who continues the Western cosmological assumption that we can and should only release what we understand. It removes value while minimizing denigrating all offensive transnational evidence. And interpretation as stasis and predictable as bad faith. There is no community consensus on what the terms of this resolution be proven by mutually exclusive arguments like must change the gives you a world for standard and must be exemptions. There's an inevitable race to the bottom. They cannot solve their offense. And we mean the one is resolved of the resolution because it analyzes and deals with this element that solves their offense, bearing up certain date resolved. We're just my analysis to deal with. And there is ground which is a functional limit. Any defensive status quo, antitrust, and economics meets chaos is the core topic. Nag structuralist critiques like Afro-past psychological studies of structural Marxism clash with the Af and each other. It is predictable. Chaos are read in every debate on the Af and the Neg. There is no chance to research this topic without finding competition good. And framework presumes nationalist public domains. The decline of debate and democracy is caused by insular rules that make new membership and class holding cutoffs impossible. By prescribing the religion that each team has in the resolution, we eliminate those who start outside of debate or thus the Baltimore evidence. We have terminal uniqueness, cosmopolizations, and ontological inevitability, which means that the terms of debate have changed. Our truth will not be will people who claim to be their model of perfect debate citizens, but how do we respond to difference? Topicality is the response of double exclusion by both feeling to respond to and recognize demands for change, justified evidence. And what's up plans, mass proofs of politics. Distributional debate is a mass for meta-level questions of representation. The framework is frame setting, determining what the app can say. It's argumentative gerrymandering. The shields presume injustice from the very train of discourse. Many injustices are boxed out through declaring it's not what we are debating. That's the brazier evidence. Topical version and switch arguments presume that establishing a just frame when our arguments that framing cannot be just in the first place. This is especially true when the TVA uses the language of extraterritoriality, which creates the distinction between the local and global that the thesis of our criticism is rejecting. We need new modes of engagement, not choices within the current framework. Fraser in 5. Framing can accept a failing grammar frames that seek to redraw boundaries, but assume that you there agree what makes individual subjects of justice as membership of your challenging around labor framing. So its principle that principles contested is a conversion of politics of framing, which I call transformative framing, as I've seen the structural cause of injustice as the state territorial principle is self injustice by British and political spacing principle. Insulates powers from justice as self determined the revenue from misframing that is a means of inflicting or perpetuating it. And framework collapses the open tradition of cosmopolitanism. WSF spaces only work through global public spheres that listen to all claims for emancipation. Closing cosmopolitanism is the methodological domination that we criticize as the Caruso evidence. That open process is liberating Caruso 17 open cosmopolitanism references odes of travel 3 of Columbus open cosmopolitanism not blueprint to this progress preset. And recursive emancipation is about freedom just as much freedom. Openness just about openness is initiative of planetary soul society puts in a single way of thinking. The living laboratory for world citizenship. This explains the mutually contingent relationship between cosmopolitan imagination, practice of resistance, and new solidarity, mutual recognition, and radical democracy are methodologies and objectives. Reading the 1 and asserting it should be here reactivates democratic arenas. We create the
democracy and who we want to see for sure. And 5, movements are claiming to say rejecting the view which seems representing as a prerogative of belief they are, aiming to democratize the process, asserting their right to constitute who they are, transforming how by which any procedures, movements, or demanding areas for arguments they are creating a reason the world social form fashion of publics who relate this view that they are prefiguring the possibility of possibly feeling democratic justice and justice consistent with the failure to institutionalized participations and political level and deliberations better represents representation arise when at least monopolized the setting, denying voice of blocking creation for reasons submitted to, and the democratic approach of the how majorities define it is denied the chance to engage in decision about who. Did you want me to say something? Okay. Debates of political to a metanormal framework response to differences with denial rather than transformation. Openness is to newness is a process that removes toward cosmopolitanism. 1914 cosmopolitanism made possible by learning of processes, allegories, open transformative, produced by social struggles, cosmopolitan builds production of knowledge, cosmopolitanism is subject formation.
That part is marked as subject formation.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
Counter-interpretation on framework, was there one?
We think that debate should be an open forum for cosmopolitanism. So there's no like counter-interpretation per se. We haven't defined words in the resolution. However, we think that it is important to be able to introduce diverse perspectives.
Can I ask about this? So can the 1AC say whatever they want?
Just like we think that the 1AC should discuss, there should be a vision for open cosmopolitanism.
Okay.
We have not proposed an interpretation that clearly divides Af and Negra, but we think that the purpose of debate should be one in which we work towards open cosmopolitanism.
Okay.
Like we have criticized the idea of competing interpretations, if that makes sense.
Right. Let's say like, I don't know, like the KF that Asia and Ross read last year. Would teams be able to read T against that and say it is not open cosmopolitanism?
Just like, this was like, once again, you're like trying to pin the app to a like competing interpretation idea of debate. We have criticized the idea of competing models in and of itself because of all the things Andrew said in the T about substantiation.
Could the neck read T in your model debate at all?
Just like, we do not think that the purpose, that the topicality establishes the purpose of working towards open cosmo.
Cool.
Okay. Top of the 2AC to no link all this, like, all these Calhoun cards was like, we just have the USFG do things that are more inclusive for people who don't really have a voice. Well, okay, so like, it can be argued that both Israelis and Palestinians don't really have a great voice in American foreign policy. What is your solution to some sort of conflict where you have two competing voices?
Our point is that we need to have a globally focused perspective. So the notion
what is
of
the
the Israeli-Palestinian
solution?
conflict is one that we would argue is premised largely on considerations of nationality as tied within the state. So like that whole issue would not be like something that the WSF or open cosmopolitan spaces would concern themselves with. Like there would be,
So
it's a different
we just
question.
don't care.
You're sort of like asking, it's not that we don't care, it's a different question.
It's like we have, like, the whole point of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that there was an attachment between the nation and the state. The 1AC obviously challenges. So like when you are like
you all are asking what the answer to the question would be, and our criticism is prior to the question being asked in the first place.
What?
Like the premise of the question relies on an assumption that the 1AC has criticized. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. The Mead card that you've read, before you cut off the card, I'm online looking at the end of the foreign policy article. This article advocates for, quote, the Biden administration can also make use of other techniques presidents have used to gain the support of Wilsonians. One is to pressure weak countries well within Washington's sphere of influence to introduce various hot-button reforms.
I mean, I think that this card is making an even statement where even if you win the premise that the nation state is a desirable model to use, it is try or die for something different because it cannot be sustained.
I think this card is the most obvious example of the nationalists saying that Washington should do everything in its power to bully other countries and to sustain institutions.
It's like if the reforms that this evidence thinks are cosmopolitan in their vision, then like why would that not be reconcilable with the affirmative?
10 minutes starting now. Stop at 3:15. I shouldn't. And I'm gonna turn on myself, okay. We stopped right at 3:15, I'll put that in chat. Okay, I am sending it out. It's T, no cards, but just sending out for fun purposes. Okay. Does everyone have the doc? And I will say the doc won't be perfect because like a lot of my stuff written out is only like half typed out. Like I'll be going to the flow sometimes, but it should generally be structured. Okay, everyone has the doc and the word. Okay, cool. I will start in a few seconds.
Our interpretation is that the affirmation from the resolution for an internal defensive topical action, the frame for evaluating every argument on the source that debate is at its core competitive activity. Every debate is a winner or loser. We debate and determine for with brackets, trophies, and judges that enforce procedural rules like speech time. The marking cards are maybe more to debate than pure competition, but the competitive foundation of debate is something that must be prioritized when saying norms like the resolution. Everyone in debate is their win and places competition over purpose to prove that the fact that teams go for worse arguments when they're conceded or hide tricks in their effort to their rebel. Teams will never gravitate towards the most accurate structural theory of cosmopolitanism, but the one that can perm every game, beat every DA. Every specifically proves that they run a policy app all year and then switch to a K app because they decided it was more strategic and required less prep. That proves that they are dead to the logical competition within debate. That means our offense always on probability of solvency. The competitive nature of debate means voting out cannot solve their offense. Changing what is topical can't make people positive cosmopolitanism because teams will read competitively strategic arguments instead of ones they believe in. Individual debates are the worst place to try to engineer new subjectivities against nationalism because debaters are over-focused on securing the win rather than changing their viewpoint. The lack of a counter-interpretation creates a massive double bind for them. First, either one, they place no limit on what the 1ATC can say, and they don't produce open cosmopolitanism. Kentucky, Michigan, Northwestern, even Emory will keep reading hedge apps defending antitrust or read other chaos that are not about cosmopolitanism, which means they fail to create open cosmo. Or two, they force the F to defend cosmopolitanism, which is forced intelligibility, double exclusion, etc. Independently, no counter-interpretation doesn't solve our offense and is bad for K debate. First, a lack of predictability. If there's no requirement for it, or if there's no basis for what the 1AC is going to say, it is impossible to predict what the F is going to say. You can't generate specific K links like you can when the F is forced to defend governmental antitrust, which is where the best K links are born from. Second, controversiality. If there's no limit on what the app will say, the app will race in the margins and just read something that is completely not controversial, like saying the rate of the nation state excludes people, and there will be no clear negative ground. Third, it turns open cosmopolitanism because we are never prepared for a good discussion about what Cosmo should look like, and the app will just try to avoid offense and permute any other form of cosmopolitanism, which produces shallow debates over what Cosmo should look like. The impact is contestation. One, clash makes every debate better. Debates are more valuable and enjoyable. Both sides are prepared to contest each other's arguments. Marginally increased contestation is an impact to every debate. Everyone has debate for different reasons, education, competition, skills development, etc. But every single possible benefit is multiplied when debates have better research, more class, and better prepared opponents. Second, terms case argument refinement. Debates unique states allows debaters to test their arguments. Cosmopolitanism ideals and movements will inevitably face material resistance outside of this space. Constant clash over what resistance to nationalism should look like. Way better, ever better prepared to work towards a better future. The evidence says methodological nationalism permeates every part of society with true explorable skills to resist that are more important than what's inside of a single debate round. That's posture. Now, top level, the offense and 2AR will go for is that the topic in debate makes people nationalists. Even if I drop tiny warrants, this is what the 2AR will
go first. I'm going to spend the majority of my speech answering this claim. 1, Clash is an impact of this. If learning about why competition is bad is the most important thing we do, only our model solves it because it sets up debates where every affirmative team has to answer the competition K. Clash, over the span of a year, provides the most in-depth education about the topics they care about, but reading the Cosmo K as an app does not result in these debates. It is absent neg preparation and predictability teams scrap together haphazard strategies and just go for tier D impact. This proves only we create open cosmopolitanism, which turns their 2017 evidence. Their model gives zero incentive to agree on the desirability of Cosmos, since the app doesn't need to defend a specific mechanism for achieving it, so the neg will just impact or go for T. But in our model, the app has an incentive to be Cosmo so that they can permute the competition K, which is better internally to producing the debates they say are good. This link turn subjectivity formation enforcing how naturalist perspectives create super shallow opposition to naturalism, where people don't believe it, but they feel forced to by their interpretation. We create more genuine opposition to nationalism through a year of debate and research and self-discovery. Second, TVA. It has the U.S. open their courts to international plaintiffs, which allows for international antitrust enforcement. That solves their offense. The app does not need to be nationalist. One NC Crossix said the app is just about forcing the U.S. to consider global impact in policymaking, which is what the TVA does, because the app can be an advantage that it forces the U.S. to consider global impact of export cartels and forces the U.S. to use the tools of antitrust to help the entire world, not just its own citizens, which means that they could read their own app evidence about Cosmo and a global policymaking being good as an advantage. They can impact from DAs and answer counterclaims by arguing that the DAs and counterclaims are nationalists and that their frame is better. The TVA actually explicitly rejects the vision of extraterritoriality, which is currently being used as a form of legal imperialism to exclude other countries from suing U.S. courts. That turns any exclusion or methodological nationalism offense on T. There's room for the app to reject nationalism while advocating antitrust. Yes, this app might sometimes say competition is good in the economy, but that just produces debates over whether cosmopolitanism can include capitalism or if it should be socialist. Now, our interpretation produces better debates. The app, I'll describe what a year of debates would look like. At the first term, the app would read an economic growth good app, it would lose the complicated links about economic nationalism. Then the app would make their app about solving inequality and democracy. The neg would innovate their K links to become broader and even critique progressive economics. The app then would read this international justice app, and they would have to adapt the K to discuss international movements, economic development, etc. The app would leave it on the curve. With that app, the both sides would innovate and have a really in-depth debate over what should and should not be part of the cosmopolitanism future. Reading their K on the negative solves better because movements need to decide what to do with corporations. If antitrust can be a part of their movement, if the U.S. has any point of role, or what their role should be internationally, these would create specific debates about whether specific antitrust policy should be a part of our cosmopolitanism cosmopolitan demands, or whether we should completely reject them. Solve T deficits are neg ground. Imperfect apps are good, and they prove that they can read their app as a negative critique. And our topic third turns their process arguments, and Cosmo is a process, and Emory should impose one movement onto everyone. We should have Clash to figure out the best version of Cosmo. 4, only be access to internal link to subjectivity formation outside of debate through skills development. It proves our case argument was not a double turn. We agreed debate can shape our viewpoints, but only through a whole year of debate, not just after reading Emory's 20C. One-time process of Clash over a whole year means that we can develop better research skills, knowledge about specific topics like antitrust and frames for evaluating arguments like Cosmo would be nationalism. 6, they read T against K teams, so they're enforcing nationalism in 50% of their debates. 7, uncertainty means to your neg. What do their movements look like? Is Cosmo really the perfect solution? Any doubts about these? Prove you should prefer Clash over just assuming that the app is perfectly right about everything. Force intelligibility. 1, some degree of intelligibility is necessary for debate, because it's the only way that we can predict what they're going to say and have good debates about what Cosmo should look like. 2nd, the resolution is not forced on Emory. There's a whole process by which it is crafted and procedures that universities like Emory get to play a heavy hand. 3, they force cosmopolitanism on people through their counterinterpretation. 4, framework is an exclusion where impacting the 1AC's core critique of the resolution that it's too nationalist and say the resolution is good. They say resolve. Resolve means a policy policy and have type resolution legislative instruments for making policies. They say stasis is bad. Yes, there are T debates on this topic about what the nitty-gritty of antitrust means, but everyone generally agrees that it has to be the government and the core antitrust laws, which is what our interpretation is about. They say ground, but they say they'll win the potential negative ground, but ground is one concessionary and predetermined by the applicants on an artificial advantage. These will choose most defensible and close to perfect advocacy will give the neg the worst. 2, not predictable, because they can change their counterinterpretation on a debate-by-debate basis. 3, the existence of the app's literature doesn't mean that it's predictable in the resolutional context. The mechanism by which that discussion occurs always changes, and they can always just write their app to be able to permute our arguments. They say double exclusion. One, competition violent is not the same thing as reading arguments about economic competition is violent. There's something inherently violent about saying economic competition is good in a debate speech due to the whole opposing views while you are reading too. Not every app has to defend competition. You can read a soft left app that breaks on Amazon for labor abuses, etc. They say who versus what. One, we allow debates about the who neg case, directly contest this and force the app to engage this question. Two, what debates are good? Movements need to contend with policy solutions to materially challenge nationalism and determine, once we've determined the who, we then have to move on to the what, which only we allow for. Now, at the bottom, there's some cards going on here, but there's only two core arguments. First is that open cosmopolitanism is good, which was massively linked turned above, I already explained. Second is that we need new democratic arenas, and I have three arguments here. First, reading down the negative solves, you can create new democratic arenas by reading this as negative K. Second, the TVA solves. These you get to advocate against cosmopolitanism. Third, their evidence is about movements, which proves our Spittlelog argument. If the important thing is giving these movements new democratic arenas, then we create better skills and advocacy and knowledge to better argue within these democratic arenas outside of debate, like their evidence is advocated for. Yep, that's everything. I'm good for cosmics.
You good?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. No.
Yep. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay. I need to turn off my sound. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. I think hopefully slower. Okay. We're all good. So I get that you've made arguments for why our vision of debate would be terrible, blah, blah, blah. I want to talk about just this app for a hot second.
Yeah.
What would you read against the topical version of the affirmative that you would not be able to say against our affirmative?
Yep. I guess against the TVA that we proposed, we would read like a cap imperialism case, what we go for in everyday debate. And we would basically just say that like trying to impose US laws extraterritorially is imperialism, and like tries to enforce neoliberalization onto the global south.
Like,
and that is like a really good
K
debate.
It's like, do not think that people have read the cap K against this app?
But that's like a completely different, like, we think that the stasis of the resolution and forcing the app to defend government antitrust produces really good specific cap debates, because there's a bunch of evidence saying antitrust could help us move towards socialism, via democratic socialism.
Well, just like,
and then egg can K and say, no, this is a bad way to try to move.
Like, I agree that, like, in theory, that you have proposed a phenomenal development of arguments throughout the year, but just like you yourself said that you've got to the same K all year. Like,
Yeah.
what is the incentive for innovation under your model?
Because teams have written specific new apps against us that try to perm our case. So we have to develop new link arguments, new impacts, new framework arguments, new alts. Like we update like our K completely every tournament. People update their answers to our K a lot.
Just like, but why would people not develop, rigorously test their descriptions of cosmopolitanism in our vision?
Because, okay, a couple of things. One, you do not define what mechanism people need to break down, or people need to advocate cosmopolitanism within. So an app would just stand up and say Cosmo good. And what is the neg supposed to say? If the neg says we should do movements, you'd say perm. If the neg says we should do electoral politics, you would say perm. If the neg says like nationalism good, then people are defending nationalism and it doesn't solve your offense.
Okay. That's the only argument.
That was 3 arguments.
I mean,
And
fair enough.
I think I made like 14 arguments.
So just like, back to the question of just like what you would read against the topical version of the app, you give an example, your racial capitalism K, just like anything else.
I mean, like the competition K that you all read on the neg would be an answer, because you could say they forced competitive.
Just like, I guess like what I'm trying to get at with these sets of questions is like, the topic obviously forces some discussion of competition.
Yeah.
And the 1EC has said that competition is bad.
Yeah.
So like, why would your vision of preparation for the negative under this topic not necessitate some response to competition bad?
Okay, yes, like we could stand up and just like spew antitrust, hedge, economic growth good against your app. But based on your argument that debate should be open cosmopolitanism is better for the app to defend antitrust, because both sides have an incentive to be cosmopolitan. So the app can perm the K.
Right, like,
and the neg
like we said, debate.
But if the app says Cosmo bad, the neg does not have an incentive to have a debate about how to best challenge Cosmo.
Descriptions about. Do you want to?
Just case.
He's just renaming it and says like there already exists one in RP Emory PR. Or I guess another time we debated, so let's rename it.
Okay, it's sent in this case.
Oh my god, dog.
Where?
Oh.
That's so cute.
You see them?
No. I'm ready once you get that. Also, I think I need to Okay, docs been sent, anyone not good?
Your dog is really cute.
They're adorable.
Oh, wait, you need to turn on sound. Just so you can hear it. Sorry, we didn't hear you.
I said he's the main character.
True.
There's a dog on this.
I know.
I know. Okay, let's go. Vote negative on presumption the threshold for absolvency is whether they've demonstrated a meaningful shift from the status quo versus the choice was way too wishy-washy to our critiques and cosmic cosmopolitanism that you should have essentially no idea what you're voting for after the debate. Do not let them re-describe their ideal vision of cosmopolitanism to no ligating over offense because it is first and foremost inconsistent with the 1AC. All pieces of 1AC evidence, most notably their Caruso evidence, are explicitly advocating for a conception of world citizenship, their racist difference, the fact that they have simplified their explanation to say we simply privilege those who don't have a voice is exactly the kind of goalpost shifting that the 2NC criticizes where absent of rules and resolution asks to redecide their advocacy to shift out of negative offense, which makes debate impossible. All of the things they've said are necessary or possible beneath the nation state and antitrust. There is no reason that you have to overthrow the global world order or conception of the nation state to simply have the United States be more responsive to those who are marginalized. And this is proven by the top version of the advocacy. You can simply use antitrust law to incorporate global impact assessments on the flows of capital. And for example, in the case of cartels, their push for open cosmopolitanism is also unique to the point of insolvency. The idea that you can somehow overthrow the global world order inside of a single debate round is a form of lazy academic planning because it simply identifies the problem. It glosses over all of the blueprinted material steps that you need to get to imagine a better world. Imagine a better world. Their second genre of impact is about things inside the debate. There is no room for their dialogue of open cosmopolitanism here because debate is competitive activity where the ultimate incentive structure is victory. Like it or not, both teams' ultimate goals in debate is to win, and you can't get a grid of judges who have to assign a win-loss to both teams. So the judges have to make a decision on who wins an open dialogue each round, which turns all of their impacts because it would be an instantiation of whose instance of cosmopolitanism is better, which means in losing a discussion could breed resentment. The ad can't change this because they are not the NDT or the topic committee. The conception of debate as a competitive activity, first and foremost, is ingrained. The top level overview about extinction being inevitable. I don't need to win any argument about the sustainability of nationalism because even if debate is bad, even if nationalism is bad at the meta-geopolitical level, that has literally zero relevance for the structure or types of debates that we want to have on the topic. So to use a prior question, and in turn, the nation state is good and essential for global risk mitigation. It's our lived evidence. Efforts to address climate change, international development, anti-poverty, and anti-war all rely on the realities of an international political economy founded by national interests. For example, it makes no sense to impose upon China the same emissions accounting metrics or anti-dumping policies as one would the Switzerland. So the idea of a supranational higher order makes no sense, regardless of no impact to environmental destruction. 0 to 20 climate projections are predicated on the worst case and unlikely emission scenarios and ignored invasions and adaptive behaviors. Climate threats can be readily handled by adaptations such as seawalls, resilience, and relocation. If you don't believe that climate change constitutes an existential threat, use a large country with significant adaptive capacity. And their description of existential risk is way too vacuous. They just highlighted a bunch of cards that with short sentences about globalization and institutions. So you shouldn't evaluate these as actual impacts. And the whole two list of the 1ECs that they don't prescribe a blueprint to solve any of these things. Just imagine a new world order. So you should weigh impacts through the lens of solvency. I'm extending the Calhoun evidence, and you should stick with these
few criticisms because no 1AC part is descriptive of their special defense of open cosmopolitanism. The 1AC comes from a place of privilege. They should not feel comfortable investing or validating because it papers over the structural barriers and assumes that everyone has an agency to protect themselves. Cosmopolitanism is a form of utopian fantasy and a white democracy assumes that there's some sort of universal individual that everyone can be grouped into, ignoring how structural relations and power means that universal individual will always favor white elites. That allows people to shirk responsibility for global atrocities like genocide and slavery. It is easy to imagine yourself as a citizen of some world order when you have access to passports, credit cards, but you have to choose these material relations in favor of utopian whiteness, which is proven by cosmopolitans frequently disavowal of identity politics. You should notice that the 1AC has no mention of black or native people. They cannot explain in cross-text how Israel and Palestine would function as global citizens, and their instead solution is just to ignore it or say that it's something that their app would not be responsible to. The 1AC in reality would actually say that Palestine should open its borders to Israel because that is more compact with their conception of cosmopolitanism. But that would forego the historical unity that Palestinians need to fight, which is a horrible idea because the Israelis would wipe them out. White nationalists don't care about borders, and their conception also ignores all of the productive potentiality of national movements from historically oppressed peoples. Every national liberation movement from Cuba to Algeria nationalism has been important and necessary resource to counter imperialism, which turns our arguments about the nation state being a site of war and genocide. The app would tell all of these revolutionaries with important gains to see their national identity, which is the ultimate instantiation of imperialism. There are two impacts in this debate. The first is presumption. It proves that they can't move towards or away from nationalism, and they don't spill out of this round. The second impact is a reinstantiation of colonialism, because they're the activists who tell marginalized people that they should just accept being subsumed into the global order, ignoring that assimilation as genocidal. Extend or live evidence, the only blueprint for successful socio-political organizing is the nation state that the act has no ability to overcome. It's inevitable. No nation state would willingly surrender sovereignty to some supernatural authority. So even if they're right that institutions are weakening, now the pursuit of the nation state is inevitable. Second is that attempting to combine all social agents in the world to need one governance structure is way too unwieldy and would guarantee its interim collapse. Or the second piece of lit evidence also says that the nation state is good and sustainable because state control of things like the economy and immigration is driven by backlash to challenge those structures, demand change, break down racism and xenophobia, and all of which challenges the worst excesses of the state by mass improvements to living conditions and societal gains. Historic shifts prove that the world economy is not only sustainable, but results barriers to free trade and barriers to the economy, and is persistent with their framing of cosmopolitanism. The state may not be perfect, but it is a necessity, and rejection of it as a structure for change is complicit with the violence that can be pursued via incremental gains. Last argument I'll extend is that rejoining antitrust is good. They do not contend with the fundamental question of whether debate over antitrust is valuable. It is precisely that because antitrust is flawed, we can use debate as a way to generate upstream discussions on new political economies, to reform antitrust in a manner that mitigates its worst excesses. We are at the ideal political moment for this to occur, and I don't know why antitrust needs to take down global capital in order for it to be a valuable heuristic, explained in the 2NC.
We have 7:51. Yeah, I have this stuff. Do you need this? Yeah, for sure. Okay, for sure. Okay, 247. Why our set of R5 exists already? Okay. Sorry. Don't worry. Lauren. Awesome. The doc is sent. The order is the case of T.
I just need a second to open the top.
Yep. Let me know if people are good.
Yes.
Kansas good. Lauren's good. Okay, I'll get started.
Only open cosmic and reverse meta misrepresentation that friends are focused on the what of Paul is like considering the prior portion of who is represented. Anything else makes extinction level from global crises, climate change, pandemics, and societal collapse, market failures, migration, require incorporation of all voices and rejection of terminally unsustainable competition. Let's see global evidence that your alpha impact comparison double solution creates an ethical priority towards those who have voices considering the global only just evaluation, no presumption, one description, prescription. Your argument is attacked by the right to close off possibility movements that we describe, prove our project is possible, and such unless fall evidence to us. It's equally utopian feeling of plan the current that you would never do. And any of the things plans are advocating scope as a terrible standard in practice on kind of public straight, no redescription or even consistent or reading our cards wrong. They don't advocate for difference or ratio. Their critics are saying the difference is shut out in the scope. It needs to be part of global decision making force. Our method is not about solving at the end of this debate round. It is about opening space for open cosmos, which is what this round is key for. That'll be more explained on T5 at the World Social Forum. There are proposals and judges make decisions with balance based on what is determined to be in the global interest. Our whole point is not that it should not be tied to competition. Though the people that there are not trying to win the balance, they're trying to do what is best for the global collective. Now there were many environmental utopia arguments. They do have to defend extinction if they go for T.
We are proving that their interpretation forecloses open cosmos, which is key to solve global crises. The app is key to solve environmental extinction. One process or product or method has no particular goal in mind that is trying to reach what is important. The form of engagement before which is generative and energizes movements. Two ties to the nation state. Determine how possibilities currently define the course of work from a perspective that begins and ends with the nation state, because what's taken to be normal and is seen as an assumption that also fails, purely proven by treaties like Paris, which are toothless because each nation is only concerned with what happens to their citizens, that they're unwilling to go for more stringent climate mitigation procedures and policies because they do not want to be responsible for the global collective and only care about how warming impacts their citizens. Three, it's not utopia. Our method is to solve double exclusion, political and imaginary service effective challenges to the nation state paradigm. Only we have read evidence like social cognitive shifts seen in awareness of the war, anti-nationalist movements of incident concerns. I see jealousy evidence, climate impact events does not matter. When we have read an extinction card about multiple competing global crises such as pandemics, the rise of technology, etc. Even if warming design is alone cause extinction, it's only our paradigm can solve other global challenges that will. The British turn to school is worse for the impact of the certain representation. Silence is the voice of millions of the global south. Only open cosmos can bring those voices to the forefront in space like WSF, no link to homogenization of identity differences are recognized and incorporated into global decision making and consciousness. That's the Fraser and Crusoe evidence. The Israel-Palestine example is asking the wrong question. It's based on national understanding of the same population. The app is operating on a prior level that does not require you to answer that question at all. The nation state level arguments crossed by our argument that pursuit is not inevitable. We endorse movements that target the fault lines in the nation state paradigm that are successful. The last argument is nation state good. Any of these arguments require the impact that it's not just redeemability. They cannot outweigh our warning extinction impacts. National settlements between all other countries as threats to outcompete, which is the foundation for conflict. Metaverse representation determines which interests are seen as important, which means it's important to solve impossible for them to solve anything, even within the paradigm that is unsustainable. China, Russia, and a bunch of small powers are contesting the current order. Technology is wrecking social media, generating populism, invasions of the other countries like Iraq, rejecting the United States image, and all of these converging factors are proven by the media evidence. That means that their model of the nation state is not sustainable. Even if he's not for open cosmos specifically, it's just proof that under any other conception of IR, it's still trying for something different. Now, last thing is antitrust. Any arguments for antitrust are answered on team. The justification for it is to remote competition. We have criticized our vision for debate does not mean that antitrust can ever be involved at all, but we reject the competition, the concept of competing nation states, the idea that we are in a competition to find the best version of debate. Topicality. Case that ways their assertion of post-Westphalian scholarship and new arenas is the only way to solve transnational crises that make justice impossible and extinction inevitable. That's the Fraser evidence. For reclaimed space for movements like WSF, and Me Too, schools reckon occupy. That is the only ethical demand to solve open pedal spheres. As Crusoe evidence, cosmopolitanism, impact turns topicality, limits of predictability, our attempts to frame out otherness to create ethical violations of men and men's representation by limiting demands on democracy. Radical openness turns affordability to clash of testing arguments because engagement without preparation is the basis for transnational movements. That's the Crusoe evidence. Meta-ethics of democracy are prior to states that consider today question the neutrality of movements. They conceded our uniqueness, but their voice are excluded now. Flip strata. That's a democratic evidence. Are you calculating the impacts? How we there's on scope? That's they continue to trounce cell and verbals and clover predictably, infinitely discount incommensurable balance. You don't have an external impact and have gone for clash solves the app better, which means that any principle link means you have to have an app. Now they've said we go for other stuff and other debates. Australian policy after going for T does not matter. The question is whether it's a good idea to advance open cosmos in this space. We control uniqueness because there's a lack of form for open cosmos for adjustment and meta misrepresentation. Now they've read the same K all year, so it equally applies to that. The same debate is not just a game, but it is primarily one. They cannot just be competition because we both read subject to the impacts of how content shapes knowledge. It does not overturn debate, but they're prescriptively that it does causes violence. People do debate instead of other activities because of scholarship, social relationships, love of research. Plus, that we should only care about winning. It requires seeing community members as enemies, fighting to shrink debates to increase meta pods, and not giving judgment to high schools or other teams that see canon evidence. Teams that begin to prioritize card cutters or community builders, and schools that help with the novice packer for this exact reason, which means the activity is unsustainable. Argument is not that if you vote after this debate, you automatically orient your subject towards it. However, a model debate, the purpose is debates over prescription and plan focus, naturalize the descriptive understandings of the world means we can never escape the nation state paradigm. We always replicate in our social relations. They say counter-interpretation double blind. If this is our critique of models, which comes prior, we're critiquing the notion that we should be responsible for what other people should do or set frames that require certain things of people. Comparing models as a natural tactic and then all of the concept of model to certain such as models in order to the imperatives and competitive speed for continuous comparisons, learning universal practice find difference and edge competitive advantage models and because national the change can be interpreted as a commercial which these students and service competition state functions. There is a negative competition good and they have some big business, but it will impact the lack of preparedness. It's more real world and encourages critical thinking for the negative have to apply the political contributions they've done to other things. That proves that the net ground is more predetermined under their model than ours because policy officers and corporate community are currently ready to be tricky in debate classrooms with beliefs that have fully generic. So those debates are worse than the ones that we've forwarded. Now, the topic is nationalists. I will respond to every word. If class is not solved and they do not turn subject to your arguments, then when we focus a bit on prescriptive policies, nationalists are descriptive understandings of the world. Think about this in the examples of how debates go down that they've provided every app and they've described never gets to the question of how we describe the world because debates always are at the level of policies that we ought to pass. The second is that any argument they do not have an external impact. That was not above, but they count with the doing some of their models of open cosmos simultaneously. Finally, The switch side topical version, the topical version, switch side best are produced reform purposes of frame setting technique, the gerrymander's argument framing and gerrymandering the ethical injustice center attempts to establish a just frame for argumentation or recreate misrepresentation at the level of form. That's the crucial evidence. It means that their causal quality cannot be open because the conditions accept the performance is crucial evidence. But if zeros are often to read on the negatives, they have answers to the app files, so they can respond to the app, but they have just chosen not to.
Okay, we I'm gonna mute. Could you mute him? Awesome. We are starting the prep at 3:15. I'll start my timer in like 5 seconds. Okay, starting. Okay, we stop prep. I just am gonna pull up the time.
it is going to be topicality of the case. Okay. Everybody good? Cool. Preserving clashes of linear impact. Every debate is better when the negative is more productive. A specific case study, and they are prepared to answer what the other two is debating better on both sides. It means that we learn more about the content that we are here to debate about. We agree with them that everyone is in debate for different reasons, whether it's scholarship, skills development, because they're interested about the research, etc. But everything is better when you can prepare for opportunities before the tournament. When you have better debates, it makes it more enjoyable to judge, be a part of the debate, and no matter what your reason for being in debate is, debates are better when there are more clashes. This is a linear impact that is going to outweigh because we have a major link turn to their stuff, which means that if we win any semblance of our major link turn, only we have an external impact about a linear impact clash that we access, especially when they have no counter interpretation. It means that they have no way of solving our clash impact, but we do have a way to access their impact now. We solve open cosmo best. There were a ton of arguments in the 2NC, and we are just way ahead of this, which means any residual app offense is linked turn by us. Top level, you should prefer specificity examples and actual description of what debate looks like. You have no idea what the affirmative model debate looks like other than rejecting debates about models that are super vague about their impact terms and just applying generic impact terms like predictability back. We have specific arguments about what debates look like under our model, what teams would agree, how the debates would play out, etc. So you should inherently prefer that and not do the work for them. Now, here are all of our arguments. First, we allow for better open cosmopolitanism. They've described it as having a debate where both sides agree Cosmo is bad and have a debate about how to best access that. We allow that because the negative can read the competition K under our vision of the topic and argue that cosmopolitanism is good and that antitrust is a form of competition. This incentivizes the app to move towards cosmopolitanism, Cosmos, so that they can permute the K and say that they are a form of antitrust that is Cosmo, which means that we have a debate over whether antitrust, whether economics, whether capitalism, whether government reform can be a part of Cosmo, or whether our movement should totally reject that. However, their model of debate does not incentivize this because there's no clear app stasis or app mechanism for how they have to reject Cosmo, which means that the app will always write their app in a way that can permute every K and just agree with the way that the next entity should challenge cosmopolitanism, which means that we never have vital debates over how to tackle nationalism. Second, they produce more shallow debates because if the affirmative is just saying that Cosmo is bad, then it is unpredictable. The negative is just going to throw T, impact trends, etc. at the wall. But if you force specific debates about antitrust, that means we have specific research about antitrust. We have debates about whether antitrust policies specifically have a role to play in cosmopolitanism, and we have a whole year of debates about this. This goes into our third argument, which is about skills development. It's the only way that we can actually access the affirmative impact. Like when they talk about the World Social Forum, our cosmopolitanism ideals will inevitably be challenged by nationalists out of debate. So it's a question of whether we can foster skills and learn the best arguments against nationalism within debate. We better access this through a whole year of debate and the whole process of debating about the resolution having clash. Their offense is just based on initial exposure to the 1AC, which cannot have a meaningful impact on subjectivity formation. Now, this is all especially true because of the TVA, which I'll do here. Not only does it solve the affirmative offense, because it proves that there's no exclusion and proves that you don't have to defend nationalism on the app, but it proves a specific example of how we access open Cosmo better than we do. The TVA is headed to have U.S. do global antitrust and allow international plaintiffs to sue within U.S. courts. You could read advantages about how they're being excluded from decision calculus now, and the global south should be able to sue and break down Western export cartels. You could read cosmopolitanism good as a way to impact your DAs and counterclaims, and as a justification for your 1AC. They said cross-ex that their vision of Cosmo is just the state caring about global populations, which is certainly accessed by the TVA. And now this produces better debates over the entire year. I don't have to rehash the 2NC example because it was super in-depth and they didn't answer it, but that proves how we would have good debates over Cosmo within our model of debate and using the TVA. Now, the app doesn't say the app counter-interpretation is going to win some of this debate. The teams can defend anything in the 1AC, which means that they do not solve open cosmopolitanism because big policy schools will just read nationalist and pro-antitrust 1ACs because there's no compelling arguments to sue them, or you do have the vision of the topic that forces people to defend Cosmo, which is exclusionary, and links your offense by attempting to impose a stasis on people. They also concede this counter-interpretation undermines K debate because there are no predictable and controversial 1ACs, which which is the only way that you can generate negative K links and have the good open Cosmo debate. So they say that predictability is bad. For our top level explanation of how we create better open Cosmo, internal link turns the impact to this argument, even if they want to link up predictably, but regardless, some form of predictability is good. It's the only way that we can have meaningful debates over how to design our cosmopolitan future. People aren't prepared to debate each other and they can't predict what the other side are going to say. We're not going to have meaningful debates about how to improve cosmopolitanism, and we have and they have no examples of which specific debaters are actually feeling excluded under this model. Emory is a huge school, and they run a policy out most of the year now. They have largely agreed with us that debate is a competitive activity. Viewing it as competitive is not bad, it is just reality. We do agree that there are other reasons that people do debate, but you have to consider competition when designing the topic. These are competitive centers around the art industry, and we obviously do not preclude community building outside the round. We're trying to do that inside the round when its attention value is that. The weak hate models argument was answered by the answer to the predictability TA. The we have negative ground argument is proven that their interpretation and their model does not provide sufficient negative ground to the case. Weight impacts through the lens of solvency, there's a meaningful difference in institutions faltering and that they're holding a transitional citizenship. It will require more political will than currently exists. For two, but the nation states the noble views the most developed and preferred socio-political structure in history. No state would willingly surrender sovereignty, of course, for cover materiality, loyalty, etc. Regardless, nothing they decide is accidental. They drop their climate impact defense. They have no impact evidence for the rest of it, and they cannot access it in debate. We have provided way more explanation of how we can actually spell out a debate and how we access the debate impacts better.
I go to 47.
Check the chat to make sure.
I'm pretty sure it was 247.
I'm starting it.
Thank you.
Here. Okay. Let me paste it. Just gonna switch the mask switch.
It's on the ground.
It's on the ground there. Okay. I think everyone is good. Let me check forward. Okay, cool. I'll start back. 10 seconds.
Open Cosmos, the only ethical debate manifest representation reframes justice and requires creating publics to debate voices are heard. Debate is a political community open to metanorms and engaging methodological openness and reframe subjectivity. The question of this debate is how we should respond to new debates. I want to see positive post-Westphalian concept of responsibility where we create and consider voices normally excluded and question rules. This allows creation of transnational movements like WSF, BLM, Me Too, School Strike, Occupy. These spaces did not always exist, but like the app, we're opened up by imagining desirable futures. It's not only a descriptive claim that debates interactions affect research practice, but a prescriptive claim that we can use this space to generate counter-publics. Political will is the first tool in our argument is irrelevant for our solvency mechanism. The tool does not answer. Description is prescription, which proves that this debate is necessary because the way we talk about open cosmos structures, the way it unfolds, there is no political will for an antitrust policy either, but team treating claims when debates on endorsing all the time, so there's no reason our method should be punished by this argument today, so that no state willingly surrenders support, but they have not answered the anti-evidence that the ongoing socio-cognitive shift that expands around what is possible beyond just the nation state. Their argument is conditioned by the dominant scholarship of the nation state centrism, which our evidence criticizes. We do have a terminal impact and solve it, even if there's climate defense. We've been arguments on pandemics and tech development, and the one are like AI that have not responded to global crises require a global outlook, and only we access that team. Framework is the elimination of otherness and the basic unity, the epistemic force of topicality relies on exclusion and legibility through Lewis and predictability. These processes are not neutral but frame out cosmopolitan products, topical version, and switch side our attempts to gerrymander debate by drawing more borders around discourse, preserving fairness, and structurally justice. The active meta representation preventing transformative politics that partition in political space because their framework brings an instinctual response to bracket out arguments that are other to us. They have conceded cosmopolitanization is inevitable just as limits democracy cannot deal with inevitable globalization. The negative framework cannot deal with changes that have already happened in debate. I mean, chaos or non-competitive concerns. The only answer is radical cosmopolitan democracy. That's Habibi and McNay. The issue with the two are is that they do not have an external impact. They have gone for clash, but the only impact tied to clash is that they solve our offense better, which is if we win 1% risk of a link, then it automatically you vote affirmative. The issue with the two is also that they have missed the level of form in this debate. They might win that their model of debate at a level of content can access discussions about open cosmopolitanism, but they have lost this debate at a level of form because we have a massive impact towards why clash driven by competition is bad and literally collapses debate. They have made a descriptive claim about status quo debate as competitive and reason that debate will inevitably be driven by competition without warrants for why that is true. Competition first is bad, necessitates seeing debaters as zero-sum units where every school that drops out is a nation state we do not have to compete with. Other schools are just one more key thing that we try to eliminate. Total warfare is invariably baked into competition with the resolution of the one and see this applies to their arguments about competition within a route because it actively shuts out the possibility of genuine relationships to our content, which they said is important when our telos is not open cosmo, but rather simply winning debate as solely competitive collapses the activity debate is shrinking, so we control uniqueness. Schools don't help with an honest second, so their teams win despite harm to others. Judges don't flow because they can spend time cutting card in school, dedicate all their resources to card cutters over community builders, relegating a select few to unsustainable care, which proves the trade-off. It's not inevitable or the reality of debate, like the 2-hour clause that if we are only here to win, people should not engage, write topic papers, or give feedback to debaters every hour. We have all spent at camp helping the high schooler is an anti-competitive practice that Kansas's framework argument punishes because they might not go to Kansas. The community aspect of debate, social relationships, the love for arguments we read and respect we are due is what pushes people to continue showing up, not the competitive aspect. There is no distinction between description and prescription. That's corrosive. It's important for this argument because winning competition that is an offensive reason for why we should theorize debate differently because how we think about it literally manifests into reality. Competition that is not only a massive Impact would also implicate how you evaluate negative offense. It's impossible to vote negative for Clash outweighs or solves the app better when the competition that drives Clash literally makes debate unsustainable and destroys its revolutionary potential. The argument that we are also competitive is stupid because just because everyone has read an app and a different debate does not mean anything. It equally applies to them given that Kansas themselves has said that they've gone for the same cap gate every single fucking round this year, which proves that their argument innovation internal link is just as much as ours, which means that there's only a risk of app offense. Debate can exist without competition. The LDSF's legacy of debates and submitting ballots for proposals and Quentin's decision to have a topic, but be open to ideas all through things like ballots, size, and topics that they assume mandate competition can exist towards open cosmos. That's the crucial evidence to our examples. Assume the worst of our open cosmos, which is the competitive advantage scores that we have criticized. Their argument that big schools will bring 10 does not assume our vision for debate, i.e. the only incentive for teams to proliferate random policy apps is competition, which voting out literally rejects. It does not diminish the quality of candidates because we have made an argument for why description, it comes prior to prescription. Every single argument that they have for why specificity matters or our model creates shallow debates is impact driven by this argument because when we have debates over our descriptive undertakings of the world that precedes the way in which we prescribe politics, which means that it's offense for us. All of this proves prior type to example. We don't need to our model is perfect, but there's no competitive incentives are a bad way to orient ourselves in debate. The threshold for voting out is not counter in terms solves, but rather a rejection of meta norms and their violent enforcement. Comparing models to the nationalistic tactic, the search for competition advantage universalizes the search for difference because race to the top logic inculcates a desire for competition as the candidate evidence. Think of this as a reasonability argument with offense for why competing in terms is not the way you evaluate this debate thing. We should not be beholden to the worst instances of our model, especially since the app has said competition bet on a topic that mandates discussion over competition. This proves that it solves a frame for all negative offenses that we have so much defense in the 1 yard that the 2 yard simply does not get to, so we cannot possibly imagine what a negative ballot would be. They can negate our app, the competition bet on a topic about competitiveness. If you did any research, you would come across big business good, consumer welfare, it has innovation, all of which compete with the app because they say competition good, switching sides. They've conceded that the 2 yard proves defense because they have 2 AC blocks of security cost more cap that all negate our theory, which means they can still have the debates that they want. And teams have their Clash opportunities. It proves they have submission preparation, but it also implicates the internal link because it just proves that resolutionalization is the thing. The 2 NR has also conceded that the topic lacks definitionalization proven by mutually exclusive definitions of expand the scope, anti-competitive and prohibition. The last thing I'll answer is the top version of the app. They're all impacted by our partitioning political space arguments and forced intelligibility arguments. Solves not our office about competition being better, how discussions go down, because the only way to rationalize top version of the app or switch side debate is under a vision of competition, because teams that negate those apps fall back on process cap plans or script the core questions or go for the core NHS thing, which proves that they can never access discussions at a level of description, which is our offense.
Debate.
Debate.
Does anyone want to read any cards? No.
Let me just double check with Lauren. Lauren, would you like me to start back?
Yeah.
Sorry, you said no, right?